As Laura mentioned while introducing me, I currently find myself living in Manhattan, the heart of New York City. Thanks to me picking up one of the most unfortunately timed cases of COVID this past week, that happens to be where I'm joining you from today. Which has obviously complicated things a bit for today's service, and I really appreciate you all joining us and any clunkiness that has arisen from that. It's also complicated this sermon, because, when I initially wrote this sermon, I had planned to start off by noting how much I love coming out to Ridgewood. I planned to revel in how Ridgewood offers such a nice change of pace from my daily routine here in Manhattan. But alas, here I am still in New York. And even though there's less than 30 miles between the apartment where I'm sitting and Anderson Hall, where those of you who are in person are watching this, it feels like the two might as well be a world away. The impression that New York City gives off is the polar opposite of Ridgewood's quaint and quiet small town feeling. New York is famously called the city that never sleeps. It's a city that is always in motion, as I'm sure all of you have experienced at some point, whether for work or for visiting folks or for coming here to enjoy some of our cultural amenities. And as someone who grew up in a sleepy suburb, I just can't help but notice how much hustle and bustle there is here in the city. Wherever I look, people are always on the go. The subway system is always running with trains going late into the night, and I can always hear some siren blaring off in the distance. And to be 100% honest with you all, you might too, depending on what's going on around here for the next 10 minutes or so. Now, New York isn't just a place that's always on the go. It's also a place that's always going up. It's a city that is always under construction. When I first visited New York in high school, one of the first things that stood out to me about the city was the scaffolding. That stuff just seemed to be everywhere. And that didn't really change once I moved here. For the first few months I lived in the city, I couldn't get over the fact that at least one building on every single block seemed to have at least some kind of scaffold on it. There's scaffolding next to skyscrapers, there was scaffolding over the sidewalks, there was even scaffolding outside the window to my first New York apartment, which became this alarm clock when workers started walking across it every morning at 7:30 on the dot. Now, when I was working in Midtown Manhattan last summer, I walked through a veritable forest of scaffolding every day during a commute from Penn Station to the East River. And there's a stretch of it that always stands out in my mind, about a block from the Empire State Building. For those of you who are familiar with the city, this is the corner where Broadway meets 33rd Street. And at that corner, scaffolding wrapped all the way around the corner building. It stretched all the way down the block in both directions, and it went all the way up to the top of the building, 10, 15 stories above the ground. There wasn't an inch of that building that wasn't covered by at least some scaffold. And it would get so dark as I walked underneath them that some mornings it almost felt like I was journeying through a cave on my way to work. And I wasn't the only one who this scaffolding stood out to. As I was making my way through that scaffold cavern one morning, I passed two middle-aged women. I wouldn't have noticed them, except that just as they passed, one's eyes suddenly jutted up towards the heavens and her face contorted into this grimace. I heard her let out an ugh, and that turned into an impassioned lament. "When will all the scaffolding come down?" she cried. "When will all the scaffolding come down?" Now, I do want to say that I don't make a habit of eavesdropping on people, but I also have to say that as far as lines I've overheard on the sidewalk go, there is something really special about when all the scaffolding come down. There's just something that is so honest about the question, something that I think is so common in the yearning behind it. It has a desire for the nuisance and the eyesore of the scaffolding to come down, and a belief that underneath the scaffolding is the building as it really is the building as it was intended to be by its creators in all of its beauty. Yes, good people, when will all the scaffolding come down? Now, spoiler alert for those of you who might be on the edge of your seats about the answer to that question, when will all the scaffolding come down? All of it? All across New York and across Ridgewood and all across the whole world? Never. Never. There will never be a day when there's a New York or a world without at least some scaffolding. Sure, the scaffolding in front of one building might come down, but then more of it's just going to go up in front of another building. As was the case that I experienced, the scaffolding in front of your apartment building in Manhattan might come down, but it'll just go up in front of your church in your UU church in Brooklyn. And another spoiler alert for you all. I'm not just talking about scaffolding. I'm not just talking about New York City. I'm not just talking about buildings. I do come from a family of construction workers and home builders, but even I would have a hard time spinning a whole sermon about scaffolds. No, dear ones, I'm also talking about what it means to be human, what it means to go through life as an individual and as part of a group, and yes, even as part of spiritual communities like this one that we're gathered in today. I want to suggest that each of us, every single person who's gathered here on the Zoom with me and in person and Anderson and every other person on earth is a lot like New York. Each of us is always under construction, that we are always a work in progress, at least in some way. And on some level, we know that this is true. The sciences teach us that everything is always in some state of flux. At least in this church, we believe in science and in the science of biology and evolution, know that all species are constantly changing and adapting to their surroundings. We know that the cosmos are ever moving and unfolding, planets, stars, and galaxies swirling around one another as the universe literally expands out and out and out beyond its own limits. We know that our whole universe is connected, that everything influences everything else, every action having an equal and opposite reaction, every ray of light spreading across billions of light years of space, touching everything in its wake, and everything that we as humans do influencing other species' evolution and survival, or lack thereof. We know this. We know that this is how the universe and the world work. And yet, good people, we put all this pressure on ourselves, telling ourselves that we should somehow be finished products, that I should somehow have it all figured out, or failing at that, that I should at least be well on my way to figuring it out, that I should be a perfect person, or at least making darned good progress towards being one. Now, obviously, a lot of that pressure doesn't come from ourselves. It comes from sources outside of us. Here in America, we live in a society that is obsessed with perfection, a society that judges us based on how well we are able to score on tests when we're kids and by how well we're able to do our jobs once we're adults. And once we internalize those standards of perfection, we end up judging ourselves according to them. And a final spoiler alert for you all, when the standard is perfection, we don't end up grading particularly well. And as a result, we end up feeling all this shame and disappointment and pain about who we are and who we're not. We get stuck in what I want to call this perfection or bust mindset. Perfection or bust. We end up thinking that we are either perfect and good or we're flawed and bad. So this is one way that I think we can benefit from remembering that we are always under construction. When we remember that we are always under construction, it puts a barrier between us and the perfectionism of our culture that says that we have to be finished products. It reminds us that we have not reached our end goal, if there is even an end goal to begin with. It reminds us that our stories are not finished, as our reading today reminds us. And this is where I think the notion of ourselves as being under construction can really help us. Because if our stories are still under construction, if our stories are still being written, we have the power to participate in them. We have the power to participate in the construction of who we are and who our communities are. Rather than trying to uncover some perfect version of ourselves that's hidden under scaffolding, we get to focus on building the best version of ourselves that we can from what we have right here. We become less like geologists trying to unearth perfect diamonds that are buried deep underground, and a lot more like Michelangelo, giving form to David from a slab of unshaped stone. Now, to put it a little more plainly, we get to decide what kind of people we want to become, and then we get to work towards our vision for becoming those types of people. Now, for those of you who lean towards theism and a belief in God, this is an idea that mystics have explored powerfully. And most popular conceptions of monotheistic religions like Christianity that we hear about here in the US, the power to create, to construct, is typically reserved for God. In the Hebrew Bible's book of Genesis, for example, it's God who creates the heavens and the earth, God who creates the creatures of the earth and the land and the sea, God who creates humans in God's own image. But some of the mystics offer us a different view. Take, for example, Thomas Merton, the great Catholic American monk, activist, and spiritual writer. Merton wrote about a loving God who gives all people creative freedom and power in our lives. Our vocation is not simply to be, Merton wrote, but to work together with God in the creation of our own life, our own identity, and our own destiny. He went on to write, we are even called to share with God the work of creating the truth of our identity. In other words, to say that we are under construction and to say that we have a role in that process is to make a strong theological claim. It is to do nothing less than to stake a claim into the divine work of creation. Now, I know that we're in a UU church, and so that not all of us here might believe in God. But regardless of whether or not you think God is a part of the equation, the work of constructing ourselves is undoubtedly collaborative. It's collaborative. We are, of course, not the only builders of ourselves, the only authors of our stories, or the only artists carving away at the slabs of stone. Our lives are, as I mentioned earlier, influenced by everyone and by everything that we encounter. And here too, good people, I find hope. Because if our stories are shaped by everyone and everything that touches us, then it's just as true that we shape the stories of everyone and everything that we touch. We get to participate in the beautiful and the messy and the life-giving work of deciding what types of relationships we want to have with the people and the world around us. We get to decide what types of communities we want to belong to, and then we get to work together to build those communities. And on this subject of collaboration and community, I want to return to the image of the scaffolds that I began with today. Because sometimes in life, sometimes we hit rough patches. We experience losses or difficulties or challenges or illnesses like the one that I have. And at a lot of these difficult times, it becomes impossible to work towards progress or growth or flourishing. Becoming the people that we dream of begins to feel a lot like a pipe dream when all we can worry about is survival, when all we can do is just get to the next day. And at times like that, we need to enter into a period of recovery. We need to enter into a time of restoration for our hearts and our minds and our bodies and our spirits. We need to put up some scaffolding, so to speak, and begin doing some maintenance and repair work on the buildings that are our lives. But we're not alone in this work. All of us, but especially those of us who gather in communities like this one, are surrounded with people to help us. Much like that Amish community that we saw in today's offertory video, we have lots of folks around us who are willing to lend a hand. We are surrounded by people who can be the scaffold, be the supports for us in our times of need. And if we are going to build a better world, good people, if we are going to build the beloved community that we talk about as you use, we have to start close to home. And for that, we have to embrace our imperfect selves, the selves that we are right now. We need to remember that each and every one of us and each and every one of our communities are always under construction. We need to think less like that woman on the sidewalk who longed to see some perfect version of the building underneath the scaffolds. We need to stop asking questions like, when will all the scaffolding come down? And begin asking questions like, where is the scaffolding in my life right now? Where's the scaffolding in my life? As we leave this place, I invite each and every one of you to join me in a practice of asking ourselves where that scaffolding is, of asking ourselves questions like, what parts of me need tending to? What kinds of supports, what kind of scaffolds do I need? And also, who around me needs tending to? Who around me is going through a difficult period? Who around me needs some support? Just needs someone to be the scaffolding for them in their time of maintenance and repair. And what about my communities? What kind of maintenance do they need? What kind of repairs do the groups that I belong to need? And how can I support them in doing that work? In short, good people, I invite us to ask, how can I contribute to the great construction project that is my life and the life of the world around me? In the days to come, may we hold ourselves and each other gently, knowing that we are always under construction. May we seek out ways to be the scaffolding for one another, to support one another, to heal one another's wounds in this world that far too often feels like it's breaking down and falling apart. And when it's our turn to do the breaking and then the healing, may each of us be receptive to the scaffolds of care and love and support that others around us offer. May this be so. May all of this be so, and blessed be.